Imagine ruling one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen for more than 600 years, and then losing everything almost overnight. The Ottoman dynasty wasn't just another royal family. For generations, they ruled across 3 continents. Their armies changed history. Their palaces symbolized power. Millions of people lived under their rule, and for centuries, it probably felt like their empire would never end. But history can turn faster than anyone expects. In what felt like the blink of an eye, the throne was gone. Their citizenship was taken away. Their homes, palaces, and wealth were confiscated. Even the right to return to the country their family had built was stripped from them. Then came the order that changed everything. 156 members of the Ottoman royal family were told to pack what they could carry and leave Turkey forever. No promises. No second chances. Just leave. And that's when the real story began. Princes, who had spent their lives preparing to lead armies, suddenly had no country to call home. Some wandered through Europe with almost nothing. They weren't treated like royalty anymore. They were refugees. Princesses, who had grown up surrounded by servants, found themselves doing jobs they had never imagined. Some washed dishes. Some worked in kitchens. Others sold the last pieces of jewelry they owned just to survive another week. For some, even that wasn't enough. There are documented accounts of members of the Ottoman dynasty searching through garbage for food because they simply had nowhere else to turn. Think about that for a moment. People whose ancestors once ruled millions were now struggling just to eat. It's hard to imagine a fall any more dramatic than that. This isn't just a story about the collapse of an empire. It's a story about losing your home, your identity, your future, and almost every part of the life you thought would last forever. Power disappeared, wealth disappeared, status disappeared. But the people were still there, forced to figure out how to survive in a world that no longer cared who they had once been. So here's the question that stays with me. Was this the most tragic downfall of any royal family in modern history? Or was it simply the brutal price that history sometimes demands when an empire comes to an end? To understand how shocking the Ottoman Empire's collapse really was, you first have to understand how powerful it once was. This wasn't a kingdom that lasted for a few generations. The Ottoman dynasty ruled for more than 600 years, from the late 1200s until the early 1900s. That's longer than many countries have even existed. At its peak, the empire stretched across 3 continents. Its territory reached deep into Europe, spread across much of the Middle East, and covered large parts of North Africa. It connected cultures, religions, and trade routes on a scale that few empires ever managed. Over those 6 centuries, 36 sultans sat on the Ottoman throne. Some expanded the empire through conquest. Others focused on strengthening its government, economy, and influence. Each ruler inherited not just land, but the responsibility of keeping one of the world's largest empires together. The Ottomans also controlled some of the most important trade routes between East and West. Goods, ideas, and people moved through their territory every day. That gave the empire enormous economic power and made it a key player in global commerce for centuries. But their influence wasn't only political or military. The Ottoman sultans also carried the title of caliph, which made them the symbolic spiritual leaders of the Sunni Muslim world. That gave them authority far beyond their borders. Their decisions mattered not only to the people living inside the empire, but also to millions of Muslims across different regions. For hundreds of years, the Ottoman Empire stood as one of the strongest and most influential powers on earth. Its armies were respected. Its rulers were feared. Its capital became one of the world's greatest cities, and many people believed the empire would last forever. Looking back now, it's almost impossible to imagine that something this powerful could disappear. But history has a way of proving that no empire, no matter how rich, how respected, or how dominant it seems, is immune to change. And for the Ottoman dynasty, that change would come faster and hit harder than anyone could have imagined. For an empire that had stood strong for more than 6 centuries, the decline didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly. Year after year, the cracks kept getting bigger. By the mid-1800s, European leaders had already given the Ottoman Empire a harsh nickname, the sick man of Europe. It wasn't meant as an insult just for the sake of it. It reflected what everyone could see. The empire was losing its strength, and many believed it was only a matter of time before it collapsed. The biggest problem was territory. The Ottomans kept losing land. Russia pushed farther south, taking advantage of the empire's weakness. Greece won its independence. Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria also broke away. Each loss made the empire smaller and weaker than before. At the same time, other European powers were expanding their own influence. France took control of Algeria. Britain tightened its grip on Egypt, one of the empire's most valuable regions. Little by little, the Ottoman Empire was losing both its land and its influence. The government knew things had to change. That's why the Ottoman leaders launched the Tanzimat reforms, hoping to modernize the military, improve the legal system, and strengthen education. They wanted to build a stronger, more efficient state that could compete with the rising powers of Europe. But those reforms simply weren't enough. The empire was carrying enormous debt, much of it owed to European banks. Financial pressure kept growing, making it harder to fix deeper problems. At the same time, the population itself was becoming harder to hold together. The empire included many different ethnic groups, languages, and religions. As nationalist movements spread across Europe, more people began demanding independence instead of remaining under Ottoman rule. Every challenge made the next one even harder to solve. The military wasn't as dominant as it once had been. The economy was struggling. Political pressure kept increasing. Internal divisions became more visible, while foreign powers continued to take advantage of every weakness. Looking back, it's easy to see that the empire wasn't brought down by one single event. It was a long chain of losses, failed recoveries, financial strain, and growing internal tension. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the unstoppable power it had once been. It was trying to survive in a world that had changed much faster than it had. By the early 1900s, the Ottoman Empire was already struggling. But what happened next didn't just weaken it, it pushed it to the edge. A new political movement known as the Young Turks took control of the government. They believed the empire could still be saved through modernization and stronger national leadership. Their goal was to rebuild the country and restore its place among the world's great powers. But history had other plans. Even before World War I began, the empire had suffered a devastating blow during the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. In just a short time, the Ottomans lost almost all of their remaining territory in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees fled into Anatolia, creating even more pressure on a government that was already overwhelmed. Then came the decision that changed everything. When World War I broke out in 1914, the Young Turks chose to side with Germany and Austria-Hungary. They believed that if the Central Powers won, the Ottoman Empire could recover lost land and regain its former influence. It was a huge gamble, and in the end, it failed. Not every battle ended in disaster. The Gallipoli campaign became one of the empire's few major victories. Ottoman forces successfully defended the peninsula against Allied attacks, and a young commander named Mustafa Kemal emerged as one of the war's greatest military leaders. But Gallipoli was the exception, not the rule. Across the rest of the empire, things kept falling apart. British forces advanced through Mesopotamia and Palestine. At the same time, the Arab Revolt, backed by British support, broke Ottoman control across much of the Arabian Peninsula. Territory that had been under Ottoman rule for centuries was slipping away piece by piece. By late 1918, there was no realistic path to victory. The empire was exhausted, its economy had been drained, its military was worn down after years of nonstop fighting. The government had little choice but to accept defeat. On the 30th of October, 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros, effectively ending its role in the war. It marked the collapse of Ottoman military power and opened the door for Allied occupation. After more than 600 years of rule, the empire that had once stretched across 3 continents was no longer in control of its own future. World War I didn't create every problem the Ottomans faced. Those problems had been building for decades. But it was the final blow, the moment when years of decline turned into the complete collapse of one of history's greatest empires. By the time Mehmed VI became the Ottoman Empire's last sultan in 1918, the empire was already falling apart. He didn't inherit a powerful nation. He inherited the remains of one. The war was ending, and it wasn't ending well for the Ottomans. Allied forces occupied Istanbul. Foreign soldiers patrolled the streets of the capital. The palace was still standing, but the authority behind it was fading fast. Mehmed VI still carried the title of Sultan and Caliph, but in reality, his power was slipping away day by day. At the same time, a new leader was changing the future of Turkey. Mustafa Kemal had begun organizing a nationalist movement in Anatolia. He rejected the post-war agreements that would have divided the country among foreign powers. Instead, he united soldiers and civilians around one goal: creating a new, independent Turkish nation. As his movement gained support, it became clear that the old Ottoman system couldn't survive alongside it. Then came the turning point. On the 1st of November, 1922, the Grand National Assembly officially abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. After more than 6 centuries, the institution that had ruled an empire across 3 continents simply ceased to exist. Overnight, Mehmed VI was no longer the Sultan. His government was declared illegitimate. Many nationalists viewed him as someone who had cooperated with the occupying powers, and there was growing talk that he could even face trial for treason. He knew staying in Istanbul wasn't an option anymore. Just a few weeks later, before sunrise, on the 17th of November 1922, Mehmed VI quietly left the city. Accompanied by his young son, he was taken to the waterfront under British protection and boarded the British battleship HMS Malaya. As the ship pulled away from Istanbul, the last Ottoman Sultan looked back at the city his family had ruled for nearly 5 centuries. According to historical accounts, he said his greatest sorrow was leaving his homeland. He would never see it again. His exile took him first to Malta, then briefly to Mecca, before he eventually settled in San Remo, Italy. Life there was nothing like people imagined. Many assumed the last sultan had enormous personal wealth waiting for him. The reality was very different. Most of the empire's wealth belonged to the state, not to him personally, and the state he had ruled no longer existed. His bank accounts were frozen, his hopes of returning to power slowly disappeared. He spent his remaining years living quietly, writing his memoirs, and watching the world move on without him. When Mehmed VI died in 1926, he wasn't surrounded by the luxury people associate with emperors. He died in a borrowed villa in Italy, with very little left to his name. It's one of history's greatest ironies. A man whose family had ruled one of the most powerful empires on earth ended his life far from home, without a throne, without a country, and with almost nothing except the memories of a world that no longer existed. Even after the Ottoman Sultanate was abolished, one important institution was still standing. The Caliphate remained. But by that point it had become mostly symbolic. Abdülmecid II was chosen as the new caliph. He wasn't a political ruler. He didn't command armies or run the government. His role was largely ceremonial, serving as the spiritual leader of the Sunni Muslim world while the new Turkish government held the real power. For a short time, it looked like this arrangement might continue. Abdülmecid II focused on cultural and religious duties. He was known as a well-educated man who loved art, music, and literature. He tried to carry himself with dignity, even though he knew his position was becoming weaker every day. But Mustafa Kemal had a completely different vision for Turkey. He wanted to build a modern republic where political authority belonged to the Sultanate, to a monarchy, and not to a religious institution. From his point of view, there was no place for the caliphate in the future he was trying to create, so the decision was made. On the 3rd of March, 1924, the Turkish Grand National Assembly voted to abolish the caliphate once and for all. It wasn't just the end of Abdülmecid II's position. It marked the end of an institution that had existed in different forms for more than 13 centuries. But the government didn't stop there. The new law stripped the entire Ottoman dynasty of Turkish citizenship. Every member of the royal family lost their legal connection to the country their ancestors had ruled for generations. Then came the confiscation. Palaces, homes, estates, and other family properties were seized by the state. The dynasty that had once owned some of the most famous residences in the empire suddenly had almost nothing left. The speed of it all was astonishing. Although the law technically allowed a short period to prepare, Abdülmecid II was given only a matter of hours. Before sunrise, officials arrived and ordered him and his family to leave immediately. They weren't even taken to Istanbul's main train station. Instead, they were quietly escorted to a smaller station to avoid attracting crowds or public sympathy. Within a single night, everything changed. The man who had once represented one of the most respected religious offices in the Islamic world was placed on a train and sent into exile. There was no ceremony, no farewell, no chance to look back, just a quiet departure into an uncertain future. That moment wasn't only the end of the caliphate, it was the moment the Ottoman dynasty truly became a family without a country, without political power, and without a home to return to. The fall of the Ottoman Empire didn't end with one sultan losing his throne. It reached every corner of the royal family. When the new Turkish government issued the exile order in 1924, 156 members of the Ottoman dynasty were officially expelled from the country. And if you include spouses, children, loyal servants, and relatives who chose to leave with them, the number of people forced into exile was even larger. Imagine hearing that you have only a few hours to pack up your entire life. No time to make plans, no chance to say goodbye. Just leave. Each family member received a relatively small amount of money to begin their new lives. It wasn't enough to build a future. In many cases, it barely covered the cost of traveling and surviving for a short time. Still, most of them weren't panicking. They truly believed this was temporary. Many left behind valuable belongings, family keepsakes, and even personal possessions because they were convinced they'd be back within a few months. They thought the political situation would settle down, public opinion would change, and eventually they would be allowed to return home. That day never came. Instead of months, the exile lasted decades. The women of the dynasty had to wait 30 years before they were finally allowed back into Turkey. The men waited even longer. For them, it took 50 years before the ban was lifted. By then, an entire generation had grown old in foreign countries. The family scattered across the world, some settled in France. Others moved to Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and different parts of Europe. A few eventually made their way to the United States. What had once been one royal household was now spread across different continents, speaking different languages, and trying to build completely new lives. Many of the younger family members grew up knowing Turkey only through stories told by their parents and grandparents. The homeland they remembered or had imagined became something they could carry only in memory. What strikes me the most is how quickly hope can disappear. At first, they packed as if they were leaving for a short trip. Then months turned into years. Years became decades. Children grew up in exile. Parents passed away far from home. Grandchildren were born in countries their ancestors had never even imagined living in. For the Ottoman dynasty, exile wasn't just about crossing a border. It meant watching an entire way of life disappear, one year at a time, while realizing that the home they expected to return to was slowly becoming nothing more than a memory. Leaving Turkey was only the beginning. The real struggle started after the Ottoman family crossed the border. Almost overnight, they became people without a country. Their Turkish citizenship had been revoked. Their travel documents expired quickly, and once they did, many family members had no way to renew them. In practical terms, they became stateless. That made traveling, finding work, or even settling down legally incredibly difficult. Most of them had never imagined living like this. They had grown up inside royal palaces, surrounded by servants and formal traditions. They were taught literature, music, military strategy, and court etiquette, not how to earn a paycheck or survive in a foreign country. Now they had to figure it out on their own. Money disappeared fast. The first thing many families sold was their jewelry. Some pieces had been passed down for generations. Others were personal gifts or family treasures. But because they were desperate, they often accepted whatever buyers offered, far below their real value. Once those valuables were gone, life became even tougher. Some former princes searched for any work they could find, but struggled because they had little practical experience outside palace life. Some princesses and noblewomen took jobs washing dishes or working in hotel kitchens, work they had never imagined doing before. For others, things became even more heartbreaking. Historical records describe members of the Ottoman dynasty begging for money, searching through garbage for food, and living in extreme poverty. Some reportedly died from hunger. It's hard to believe these were the same people whose family had once ruled one of the greatest empires in history. Not everyone ignored their suffering. Several Muslim rulers and wealthy supporters tried to help. Financial assistance came from figures such as the Nizam of Hyderabad, Prince Omar Tusun of Egypt, and King Hussein of the Hijaz. Their donations gave some members of the family a chance to survive, but the dynasty had become so scattered across different countries that much of the aid never reached everyone who needed it. Even in those desperate years, pride never completely disappeared. One story stands out. The last sultan, Mehmed VI, was offered financial support and a more comfortable life. But he refused to depend on money from a non-Muslim monarch because he believed it would compromise his dignity as a former Islamic leader. Instead, he chose to live with very little. He held on to the imperial signet and a heavy gold royal necklace that had been passed down through generations. Even when he desperately needed money, he refused to sell them. Looking back, that's what makes this story so powerful. The Ottoman family didn't just lose an empire. They lost their country, their wealth, their status, and the lives they had always known. But even after losing almost everything, many of them still held on to the one thing they believed no one could take away their dignity. When people talk about the fall of the Ottoman Empire, they often picture one sultan losing his throne. But the real story is much bigger than that. Every member of the dynasty had to find a different way to survive. Some managed to rebuild their lives. Others spent the rest of their years chasing a home they would never truly get back. Take Nezlisha Sultan, for example. She was born in 1921, just before the Ottoman Empire disappeared. In many ways, she represented the very last generation born into the old imperial world. She was only 3 years old when her family was forced into exile. Growing up in France wasn't easy. Like many members of the dynasty, her family struggled financially. But her life eventually took a different turn when she married into the Egyptian royal family. For a while, it may have seemed like she had escaped the hardships that followed so many of her relatives. Then history repeated itself. In 1952, Egypt's monarchy was overthrown. Once again, she watched a royal family lose its power. Few people have lived through the collapse of two different dynasties, but she did. Later in life, she dedicated much of her time to preserving Ottoman history and keeping her family's story alive. After decades away, she eventually returned to Istanbul, the city she had left as a child. Then there was Prince Osman Fuad. Unlike many members of the family, he had served as a military commander during World War I and had once held an important public role in Ottoman society. But exile erased all of that. He spent the rest of his life in France, far from the country he had served. When he died in 1973, he was buried in Paris instead of alongside his ancestors in Istanbul. For someone born into an imperial dynasty, that alone says everything about what exile really meant. Then there's Abdulmecid II, the last caliph. After losing his position, he quietly built a different kind of life. He spent his days painting, playing the piano, writing his memoirs, and trying to preserve a sense of dignity despite everything he had lost. His life became much smaller than it once was, but he never completely gave up the identity he carried. Not everyone found that kind of peace. Some members of the Ottoman family became caught in the political turmoil of the 20th century. Their lives crossed paths with revolutions, wars, and international conflicts their ancestors could never have imagined. And many never made it home. They died in France, Italy, Syria, Egypt, and other countries far from the land where their family had ruled for more than 6 centuries. When you look at these lives together, one thing becomes clear. The Ottoman dynasty didn't share one ending. It shared one loss. Each person carried that loss differently. Some adapted, some endured. Some spent their lives protecting the memory of a world that had disappeared, but almost all of them had to accept the same painful truth. Sometimes, surviving history is much harder than making history. For decades, the Ottoman family lived with one hope, that one day they would finally be allowed to go home. But that day took much longer than anyone expected. In 1952, nearly 3 decades after the exile began, the Turkish government finally allowed the women of the Ottoman dynasty to return. It was an important moment, but it wasn't a full reunion. The men were still banned from entering the country. Families remained divided, and many continued living abroad, waiting for their own chance to come back. That chance didn't come until 1974. 50 years after the exile had started, the male members of the dynasty were finally allowed to return to Turkey. Think about what 50 years really means. By then, many of the people who had been forced into exile were already gone. Some had died in foreign countries, others were too old to travel. And many of the younger generation had never even lived in Turkey. They had been born and raised somewhere else. Even for those who returned, it wasn't the home they remembered. The Ottoman palaces that had once been filled with family life were now museums or government buildings. Tourists walked through the same halls where their ancestors had ruled an empire. What had once been their home had become part of history. Their estates were gone. Their wealth was gone. Their titles no longer carried any political meaning. The world they had known had disappeared while they were away. Instead of returning as royalty, they came back as ordinary citizens. That had to be an emotional experience. Imagine walking through the palace where your grandparents were born, knowing you can visit it only with permission, just like everyone else. Every room would remind you of stories passed down through your family, but none of it truly belonged to you anymore. The dynasty also adopted a new surname, Osmanoglu, meaning son of Osman, honoring Osman I, the founder of the Ottoman dynasty. The name became a way of preserving their family identity, even though the empire itself was gone. Today, members of the Osmanoglu family live in Turkey, Europe, the United States, and across the Middle East. They work in business, education, the arts, and many other professions. Their lives are remarkably ordinary compared to the lives their ancestors once lived, and maybe that's the most remarkable part of this story. After half a century of exile, they finally came home. But home had changed. The country had moved on. The empire existed only in history books. The palaces had become museums, their titles had become memories, and their family legacy had become part of the nation's past rather than its future. They returned to the place they had always dreamed about, but they could never return to the world they had lost. The Ottoman Empire is gone. The throne is gone. The titles are gone, but the family itself never disappeared. Today, the descendants of the Ottoman dynasty are still alive. They're spread across Turkey, Europe, the United States, and the Middle East. Most of them live quiet, ordinary lives. Some work in business. Others teach, write, or work in the arts. If you passed one of them on the street, you probably wouldn't know they were connected to one of history's greatest empires. In many ways, that's the biggest change of all. For centuries, their family shaped the course of history. Today, they live much like everyone else. Even so, many descendants have chosen to protect their family's story. They've written books, appeared in documentaries, and taken part in cultural events that help preserve the memory of the Ottoman Empire. Their role is no longer political, it's historical, and history itself has changed. For many years after the founding of the Turkish Republic, the Ottoman period was often presented as something the country needed to leave behind. Schools focused on building a new national identity, and the empire was frequently associated with decline rather than achievement. But over the past few decades, that attitude has shifted. Interest in Ottoman history has grown dramatically. Television dramas, documentaries, books, and museum exhibitions have introduced millions of people to the empire's past. Stories about the sultans, the palaces, and the people who lived during that era have found new audiences both inside Turkey and around the world. As a result, the Ottoman dynasty is viewed with more curiosity and often more respect than it was in the early years of the Republic. That doesn't mean the family has regained any political influence. They hold no official authority. They make no claim to a throne. They don't govern anyone. They're simply citizens carrying a remarkable family history. The palaces where their ancestors once ruled are now museums. Visitors walk through grand halls, admire priceless treasures, and learn about a dynasty that shaped world history for more than 6 centuries. What was once the center of an empire has become a place where people come to remember it. I think that's what makes this story so meaningful. The Ottoman Empire didn't survive, its government didn't survive, its political power didn't survive, but its legacy did. Not through armies or crowns, but through history, culture, architecture, and the people who continue telling its story. In the end, that's what remains. Empires rise, empires fall, but the stories they leave behind can outlive them by centuries. And maybe that's the greatest reminder of all that. While power is temporary, history has a way of keeping the past alive for every new generation willing to listen. When I first started looking into the Ottoman dynasty, I thought this would be a story about politics, about wars, about the collapse of an empire. But by the end, I realized it was really a story about people. Yes, the Ottoman family lost their throne, but that was only the beginning. They lost the country their ancestors had ruled for more than 6 centuries. They lost their citizenship. They lost their homes, their palaces, and the wealth that had defined their lives. Many even lost their sense of identity. Overnight, they went from being members of one of the world's most powerful royal families to ordinary people trying to survive in places that didn't know them or owe them anything. Some spent decades hoping to return home. Some never made it back. Some died in foreign countries, far from the land where generations of their family had lived and ruled. And yet, despite everything they lost, one thing survived. The House of Osman is still here. More than 700 years after the dynasty was founded, its descendants continue to live around the world. They no longer rule an empire, they don't hold political power, but they carry a family history that few people on earth can truly understand. I think that's what makes this story unforgettable. Power can disappear, borders can change, governments can rise and fall. But history doesn't simply erase the people who lived through those moments. Their stories remain, their memories remain. And if we're willing to listen, they still have something to teach us. Maybe the greatest lesson isn't about kings or empires at all. Maybe it's about how quickly life can change, and how the things we believe will last forever sometimes disappear much sooner than we expect. The Ottoman Empire became one of the greatest powers the world had ever seen. Then it became history. So, I'll leave you with one final question. Did the Ottoman royal family deserve a fate this harsh? Or was this simply the price that history demanded when one of the world's greatest empires finally came to an end? If this story made you think, I'd love to hear your perspective. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy exploring the forgotten stories that shaped our world, don't forget to subscribe to Forgotten Code. There are many more remarkable chapters of history waiting to be uncovered.